So welcome everyone. I'm Brett Thielen. I'm the science director with the Harris Center for Conservation Education, and I'm here with my colleague Susie Spickle, our community programs director, and also our friend Sterling Gross from Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum, and of course our esteemed guest for the evening, our speaker, Dr. Robert Goodby. And everyone will do introductions in just a minute, but some guidelines to help everyone hopefully have a good Zoom experience tonight. You should have gotten a notice from Zoom that we are recording this. That's so that we can post it to YouTube for anyone who wasn't able to attend in real time. If you don't want to appear anywhere in that recording, the safest thing to do is just to turn off your video. And if you're having internet speed issues, that also turning off your video can help with that as well. We also do have closed captioning enabled for tonight's program. You can decide for yourself whether you would like to see those subtitles. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you might see uh, either a more button, and if you click on that, you might see hide or show subtitles, or sometimes it appears under a button with the letters CC. We do have we have turned off the ability for you to unmute yourselves just to make sure that everybody nobody accidentally unmutes when they shouldn't. And so, but we do have the chat turned on, and that'll be the place for us to communicate and also for you to put your questions. And Susie and I will be keeping an eye on the chat. And at the end of the program, we'll have some time for Q&A, and we'll ask as many of those questions as we can. So, Susie, have I missed anything on that part? Okay, great. So, in that case, I'll just welcome folks on behalf of the Harris Center and say a little bit about who we are for those of you who might be new to us. The Harris Center for Conservation Education is a nonprofit organization. We're based in the Monadnock region of Southwest New Hampshire, and we help people fall in love with the natural world. We do that in three main ways. Land protection. We've protected more than 27,000 acres for people and wildlife alike. Much of that is open for hiking, birding, paddling, and other recreation. We coordinate conservation research on our conserved lands and throughout the region, including some really fun community science projects where you help us collect the data on wildlife. And really, at the heart of everything we do is education for all ages, from babies in backpacks to residents of retirement communities, all points in between. If you live in the Monadnock region and have a young person in your life, there's a really good chance they've spent some time outside with one of our skilled naturalists. We work in nearly 40 schools, getting kids outside, learning about nature in their schoolyards and backyards. And we also have just an incredible calendar of events for the general public every year. I think our last year's count was close to 200. Everything from guided paddles in the warmer months to hikes to film showings and Zoom talks like this one. And nearly all of those are free of charge thanks to our generous donors. So thanks to those of you out there who support our work. And if you're new to us, I'd encourage you to check us out. I do want to mention one upcoming event that might be of interest to some of the folks here tonight. It's 1 month from tonight, same time, same place. It's on Zoom, and it's with writer and filmmaker Matthew Meyer Bolton, a talk called Raphael Pumpelly as Indiana Jones, Geology, Monadnock, and the Hidden History Beneath Our Feet. And he'll be giving an overview of Raphael Pumpelly's illustrious, sometimes swashbuckling career, including world travels, geological and archaeological adventures, and some controversial opinions. So we can put the link to that in the chat if you would like to join us for that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sterling to introduce the Mount Kearsarge Museum.
Thank you, Brett. Hi, everyone. I am Sterling Gross. I'm the curator and collections manager at Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum. Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum consists of 7 galleries, each covering a geographic region of North America, in which you will find art, cultural objects, all sorts of things from the peoples and nations who have called that place home and still do to this day call those areas home. The museum also sits on 12.5 acres, which we have our accessible Medicine Woods Trail, it's a small hiking trail, our powwow field, and our arboretum. And we have events, out inside and outside all through the year. We have one coming up later this month, February 21st. We have our annual Snow Snake Games. So if anyone wants to come and visit that, that's always a fun time. But we're honored to be here tonight, and thank you all for showing up.
Thanks, Sterling. We're really excited to partner with the Mount Kearsarge Museum on this talk. And now we're on to the main event, and it's my honor to introduce our speaker. Any of you who have seen one of Dr. Robert Goodby's talks knows that we are in for a real treat tonight. He's an exceptional speaker and teacher and storyteller. He's also an archaeologist and a professor of anthropology at Franklin Pierce University. He's a former trustee at the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum. And he's also an author of a really incredible book that I encourage you all to read if you haven't yet, A Deep Presence, 13,000 Years of Native American History, available at our local Toadstool and other places where you find books. But he's known, perhaps best known for his Paleo-Indian archaeology, and tonight he's going to be sharing with us some brand new research of his, which I'll let him tell you about. So without further ado, Bob, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, folks, all the people who are joining us this evening. I've been looking forward to doing this talk for a long time. This is a project I've been working on for the better part of a year, and it was something a little new for me. It was a good project to do during the winter months. And it really all kind of began almost 26 years ago when I joined the faculty of Franklin Pierce. And when I walked into my new classroom building, one of the first things I saw was that there were two wooden dugout canoes sitting in the hallway on trestles with almost no explanation as to what they were or where they came from. Now, we've always assumed that dugout canoes are made by Native Americans, that it's a traditional technology. And with a little digging around, I was able to figure out these actually came from the town next door, from Fitzwilliam, New Hampshire. They were discovered in 1969 by a diver, and they brought them to surface. And well, what do you do if you found a big wooden canoe at the bottom of a lake? You bring it to the local college. And so it was brought to Franklin Pierce, and they've sat there ever since. And it was a few years ago that I, with a student of mine, started looking at these in some detail. And they have a really interesting history, and a lot of it ties into the way that Native American history has been viewed in this region and in New England generally. So when the canoes were first found, there was a newspaper story discussing what the interpretations were, and they said a couple of really interesting things. Now, to back up a little bit, this is a region whose histories usually discount the presence of Native Americans. One of the most widely read histories, the history of Keene, says flat out that Indians did not live in this region. They may have wandered through on their way to other places, but they weren't actually here. And the newspaper story sort of echoes that. It denies that they were Native American canoes for a couple of reasons. One is they said, well, Native Americans would make a birch bark canoe. That was going to be easier. They claimed that you could see adze marks on the canoe from where it had been manufactured. And yet, as archaeologists, we know that Native Americans have been using adzes for 8 or 9 thousand years, initially out of stone, and then by the end of the 1600s, they're engaged in international trade with Europe, and they're using adzes made out of metal. The theories about what was being done with them, if they were made by early settlers, there was one claim in the article they were used to transport grain across this lake, which is originally called South Pond, is now known as Laurel Lake. And there was another claim that they were actually not canoes at all, but they were feed troughs used for animals, which is interesting and then sort of begs the question of why you would take a feed trough, drag it 30 feet out into a lake, fill it with stones, and sink it. It was also interesting because when I looked at this, I figured I might as well get into the town history, see if there was anything to this. So you take a look at this map. This is South Pond, now Laurel Lake, from 1858. And why would you spend days and days and days making this canoe to move things across the lake when the lake is surrounded by roads that would have made transportation very easy. And so none of that made sense. But as I was reading the town history about South Pond slash Laurel Lake, I just bumped into something else. Yeah. So the description of South Pond, and then right below it, they're describing the bodies of water. And there to the east, there's another pond called Sip Pond, which has that name because it is named after a an African American man, an escaped slave or a freed slave who was living there with his Native American wife. And so the town history it says very clearly there were Native people here. And so we're fighting against a whole tradition of denying the Native presence here. So this is where it kind of began for me. And I'm going to come back to these canoes at the very end. And we'll see what we've been able to learn about them. Now, I was also interested in this in Brett's introduction when I was writing the book that I wrote. A number of things just really kind of jumped out at me, and one of them was that we have all kinds of evidence that Native Americans here, going back 13,000 years, were not living in isolated little communities, that they had ties with other native people across the region and even across the continent. We see this in all kinds of ways. And these long distance ties to me say that people were moving, people were traveling, they were interacting with people. And canoes might have been at the heart of that. You go back to the very first people here at the end of the Pleistocene, the so-called Paleo-Indians, and they're sharing a technological tradition, making these fluted spear points that spans the entire North American continent. They're part of a very big world. A few thousand years go by, and an archaeologist, Dina Dinkhaus, in the 1970s, working on a site in Manchester, New Hampshire, was able to date the styles of some stone tools and recognize that these styles were shared by people all up and down the Atlantic seaboard, from Maine all the way to Georgia. It's a very big world, and people are interacting with each other. And other things. There's evidence that there are connections between the native people in New England and the mound building cultures in Ohio and Illinois and Indiana, like this beautiful stone tool. And you're seeing the front and back of it here that I discovered on one of my projects in Lebanon. So thinking about it as a big world, and how did people get around? And are canoes really going to be at the center of this? Now, we can see other evidence that Native people moved a lot. If you work in New Hampshire, you're very well acquainted with this map of Indian trails that we have, which is a really neat graphic depiction of the world of Native people. And it shows these trails crossing the state, connecting, extending into other states. But if you look at it, many of these trails also follow rivers. The river valleys were natural transportation corridors in a land that is hilly and irregular and rough. And so whether people are walking or canoeing, this is how they're getting about. Now, we know from a number of sources that the native people of New Hampshire and Vermont, the Abenaki, and of Maine, made two different kinds of canoes. They were making them at the time of European contact and probably for a long time before that. Birch bark canoes are really good for navigating shallow, rocky rivers. They're also really good if you have to do a lot of portaging, taking the canoe out and moving it around a waterfall or something of this sort. This is a beautiful example of a historic Abenaki canoe from Maine, but the problem with the birch bark canoes is they do not survive well. And we have very, very few examples of them. So most of my talk is going to be focused on the other type of canoe, the dugout canoes. That's where our evidence is. So this is going to be a more or less missing piece of the puzzle here. Now, this pattern again is not just New Hampshire and Vermont. It's not just New England. We're seeing this all over Eastern North America. So there's a wonderful bunch of canoes that got a lot of attention a few years back from a big lake in Wisconsin. And it's similar to what we're seeing here. So divers and archaeologists found 16 canoes, the oldest of which was more than 5,000 years old. all sort of scattered along the edge of the lake, all of them intentionally sunk. All right, they were made out of a variety of woods, not just one type. And you can see in this photograph, and this is what we see in New Hampshire and Vermont. When we're finding these canoes, they were intentionally put at the bottom. They're weighed down with stones. And the reason for that is, we think, that wooden canoes don't do well over the winter. They'll freeze and crack, and so to preserve them, you fill them with rocks, sink them down to the bottom of the lake where they'll stay unfrozen. And it's also a relatively anaerobic environment, so you're not going to get as much decay as you might get. And then in the spring, you go back and take the rocks out and haul them out again. But if for some reason you don't make it back, those canoes are going to stay there and they will preserve for a long time. Now, we have a lot of information actually on how these canoes are made, and it comes from two sources. One is we have European accounts going back to the 1500s. You see this one from Theodore de Bryan in North Carolina. And it's very basic. It's a combination of burning and scraping. And so you can see his description in this archaic language, making a new fire, sometimes burning and sometimes scraping. You start it in the center of the log, okay? And you use the log when it's fresh, when it's green, so you can better control the burning and the fire, and just keep going until it's done. Here are some contemporary native folks, and both the Nipmuc and the Mashpee Wampanoag, among other nations, have been involved in recreating these canoes and keeping this technology alive. And so you can get a sense of how it works in this photo. We have other accounts. The Europeans were really struck by this technology, so they wrote about it. William Wood, right, in the 1620s, 1630s, the same thing that was happening in North Carolina. Canoes are made of pine trees. They burn them hollow, scraping them smooth with clamshells, and then cutting the outsides with stone hatchets. And again, you can see some contemporary native people here doing this. Roger Williams, living among the Narragansett, and Williams was an astute observer of native life, spoke the Narragansett language, and describes the same sort of thing, made out of a variety of woods, combination of burning or scraping. But he also says it would take 10 or 12 days of work to make one of these. They're labor intensive. Right? And so I think they were meant to be used for quite a while. Williams also tells us, and this is really interesting, that they really range in size. Some of them carrying just a few people, but others he saw would carry up to 40 men. And if you can imagine a boat of that size, that is pretty substantial. And in the sample I'm going to look at, we're going to see some significant variation in size. So we've got good historic background on these canoes, on how they were made, and that sort of helps lay a foundation for understanding the ones we've been finding in New Hampshire and Vermont. And in our own region here, in the Monadnock region, there's a wonderful, just sort of throwaway line from one of the first European chroniclers here. 1725, Captain Samuel Willard is on the south end of Lake Menominee, and he says, we found where the Indians had been and made a canoe. So the evidence is really out there that native people are making and using these things into the 18th century. Now, this gets us into a difficult period. By the time we get into the 1730s, the Monadnock region, southern New Hampshire in general, is a dangerous frontier. We're getting into the French and Indian Wars. There's raiding back and forth, and native people are still very much a presence here. Now, most of the canoes that we have dated, and you're going to see this over and over again, actually date to the historic period, the time after European contact. Sometimes from the 18th century, when we know there are still a lot of native people here. Some of them even more recently than that. We've had a harder time finding canoes that clearly predate European contact, especially ones that predate it by a substantial amount. And yet we have reason to think that these boats were here. So, on this petroglyph or rock carving site from Maine, there are a couple of these glyphs that clearly seem to depict people in boats with paddles. We also know And Bruce Bork's book is a good source on this, that going back as much as 5,000 years ago, native people on the coast of New Hampshire and Maine were hunting swordfish. They were harpooning swordfish, and swordfish are a cold water, deep water species. You typically would have to go out 20 miles or more into the open ocean to get these fish and bring them back. And we know that native people were doing it because we find the swordfish rostrums or swords in their sites. So even if we're not finding the boats themselves, we've got good evidence to think that this technology goes back many, many years. Now, it's also been, and this is a little more problematic. Archaeologists have also assumed that canoes exist because we find very heavy-duty woodworking tools that would be perfect for making dugout canoes and are similar to the ones that are described by people like Roger Williams. So we have stone axes, we have gouges. This one from one of my sites in Swansea. Some of these are pretty substantial. They may have been used for making canoes, however, they may have been used for other things as well. Okay, so they're not a direct one-to-one, but they're certainly consistent with making boats of this sort. Uh, Now, we only have, and as I started this project, I was really anxious to be the one to find the oldest dated canoe that we had in New England. But right now, the oldest radiocarbon dated canoe that we have is from Kennebunk, Maine, in very southern Maine, recovered from a tidal salt flat by some colleagues of mine. Radiocarbon dated 1275 to 1380 AD. And radiocarbon dates, if you're not familiar with this, always come with a margin of error. And we'll see that with all of the dates that I have as well. They're not pinpoint precise, but an interesting vessel made out of birch. However, it's decayed enough, so we're not able to say how long it would have been. But this is right now the oldest dated canoe that we have in northern New England. The second oldest dated canoes actually come from northern Vermont, from Shelburne Pond, and this is one of them here. So radiocarbon dated 1450 to 1570. This is in northern Vermont, 40 or 50 years before the earliest evidence of European contact that we have. And if you're looking at this canoe and you're wondering about these holes, these were actually taken out for a radiocarbon sample and for analyzing the wood. So those are sort of modern creations. So we've got a couple out there, but the vast majority of them are from the historic period. One final one from New Hampshire. This one was found at the bottom of Ossipee Lake and came back with a radiocarbon range of a little over 200 years. Okay, but no older than 1660 AD. Now, Ossipee Lake, that area in sort of north central New Hampshire, actually has some evidence for very early European contact, but really this is almost certainly a Native American canoe. And that has been the sum and total of canoes that were sort of conclusively dated to before European contact. Now, I want to just quickly give a shout out here because when I started this project, the foundation had already been laid for me by a couple of my colleagues, and I just want to acknowledge them. Pretty much everything I'm talking about tonight is building on what they've already done and adding to it. Wonderful work by Anne Marie Plain based on her master's thesis, and she took sort of the broad perspective of she calls them New England's log boats because one of the things I learned from her research that I was not aware of, this idea that these boats are Indian boats, that they're Native American boats, is not that simple because there were many Europeans who came to the New World with their own tradition of making boats out of logs. And so once we have a real European presence here, we have to take that into account. Okay, are these boats made by Europeans, made by Indians, or maybe made by people who are drawing from both traditions? Maybe even people who have both of those heritages. So this is a really crucial piece of work. Um, Another one, a wonderful inventory of dugout canoes from Vermont, completed by a University of Vermont undergraduate, Jane Jordan, quite a few years ago. And I'm going to be referencing her work. And then finally, and this was really my starting point because I've known about this article for a long time. Colleen Dugan did a wonderful job putting together a comprehensive list of the dugout canoes we knew about from New Hampshire with measurements, where they were housed, how they were found, all this sort of thing. Put together a wonderful table listing them all and listing the dates for the ones that have been radiocarbon dated. And you can see here, these are all falling into the 19th century. And so this is where I began. I began with Colleen's article and started honing in on the canoes that didn't have dates, and then was able to find a few in addition to this. So, radiocarbon dating the dugout canoes. There are a couple things here. One of my goals was simply to get more canoes that we knew the dates on. Figured that's got to be a good thing, regardless of how the dates fall out. I was really anxious to find more of those pre-contact canoes so that we could develop a real baseline of what the Native American technology was, and then see how it changed in response to the European presence. Also, there was sort of this notion, and Marianne Plain's work really emphasized this, that canoes change after contact. That after the Europeans are here, the form changes. Particularly, you start to get squared off sterns as opposed to having both ends tapered. And if I could get some more boats, that would be a good way to test that. So I got funding to actually radiocarbon date 7 canoes. One we did in 2022, and then 6 just very, very recently with support from Franklin Pierce. Now, the process of radiocarbon dating is something that involves sending a sample of wood, in this case, to a physics lab, and that gets into a whole domain of science that I am not really particularly strong on. But basically, as an archaeologist, my only task is to take a sample of something. Radiocarbon dating works on anything organic, anything that was at one point alive, as long as it's, say, not more than 50 or 60,000 years old. And you send it into the lab. They measure the decay of radioactive isotope carbon 14 into carbon 12. Based on that, they can estimate how old that sample is. Now, the carbon dates are telling us, and I don't think this is actually a big deal, but what the carbon dates are telling us is not when the canoe was made. They're telling us when the tree died, because that's when the radiocarbon begins to decay. And I was wondering if that was going to be a factor, but one of my colleagues who works with Project Mishoon with the Native community in Massachusetts told me very, very clearly that you want a freshly cut tree. Otherwise, it's very hard to control the burning. So it takes, and we did all our dates with a very precise form of radiocarbon dating, AMS or accelerator mass spectrometry dating. All we had to do was take a very small sample, less than a gram, from some part of the canoe, tuck it in a little plastic bag, and send it off to the lab. And I work with Beta Analytic in Miami, Florida. They do the work and they send back the date. Now, one of the other things, and this was a new one for me, I hadn't seen this before and had to sort of catch up with this. But one of the things that the radiocarbon labs have found is that because of all the carbon that has been put into the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the same carbon that contributes to global warming, that has affected the way radiocarbon dates come out. And typically, we used to get one sort of date and then a standard of error around it. And now, with recent material, what we're going to see is we actually get 2 or 3 what are called intercept points on the radiocarbon calibration line. So we're going to be seeing dates and we're going to say, well, it's, this percentage, it could be in this range, this percentage in this range, so on and so forth. So a little bit different look to it. Now, my first experience with carbon dating a dugout canoe actually predates this project by quite a bit. It goes back to the early 1990s, when I was teaching at the University of New Hampshire, I got called by the Historical Society in Sandwich. They had this massive dugout canoe that had come off the bottom of Squam Lake in their collection, wanted to know if it was Native American. And I said, well, probably the best thing to do is carbon date it. So they took a sample, sent it off to the lab. And I, as an archaeologist, I love sending out radiocarbon dates because there's this great sense of anticipation waiting for the date to come back from the lab. It's kind of like Christmas because we always have a theory of what the date should be. So maybe the present is going to be just what you wanted. But there's also the possibility it could be something you weren't expecting, something even more exciting. But just like Christmas, there's also the possibility that the present you unwrap is going to be a bunch of socks. And that can happen. And this one was a case in point. So we sent the sample off, and it came back from the radiocarbon lab as modern. In fact, they said this wood was so young they could somehow even see the effects of the 1940s atomic bomb testing in it. Uh, Not at all what we were looking for, not at all what we expected, but it does raise a really interesting question. Who's making canoes like this in the 20th century? And what is being done with them? This technology is supposed to be extinct. Uh, So, with my canoes, and I'm going to go through the seven that I have here. Um, and they're in a particular order. So I'll start with the one from Derry, New Hampshire, founded 1972, supposedly made of sweet gum. But I question this because sweet gum is not really native to this area. It doesn't really occur much further north than, say, very southern New England. Nonetheless, there it is. There was also a second dugout canoe found, just like Laurel Lake. Okay, and that's an interesting pattern. This is the one that survived. And so a couple of things here. Okay. Here's where the canoe was found. And the interesting thing about Beaver Lake is it's a small body of water and its outlet is too small to paddle a canoe out of or to paddle a canoe so that you get into Beaver Lake. In other words, you can't get there from here. This canoe was made for use on this body of water only. That's the only explanation for why it was there. And when we got our radiocarbon date, and so here's the presentation of these, and we would typically get sort of the conventional date and the radiocarbon age BP. That means years before present, and in radiocarbon dating, present is set at 1950. So what this date is telling you is that it is within 30 years of 110 years before 1950. And so roughly it's in this range here, 1810 to 1870. We didn't think people were making dugout canoes then. But then you drop down to the intercept points and you see there's a 68% chance it's between 1800 and 1939 and another 25% chance it could be 1682 to 1738, much earlier, still in the historic period. And at this time in New Hampshire, in this area, we know the Abenaki are here, and Europeans are beginning to settle. So we're not really quite sure who's the creator of this canoe, if it falls in that range. Here's a second canoe. This one is from up in Andover and discovered filled with rocks, as they typically are. The local historians had accounts that said this was made by the first European settlers in the town, sometime after 1763 or so. And you can see on this close-up photo how the burning has been used to make it. And one thing I've seen over and over again, when people find a dugout canoe on the bottom of a lake, they bring it up, and the first thing they got to do is take it out for a ride. And so that's what you see in this photograph. And so just like the previous one, okay, Hopkins Pond, also known as Adder Pond, is a small, locked-in body of water. You can't take the canoe out. You can't paddle the canoe in. It was made for use on this pond. We got our radiocarbon date, and once again, we're in the 19th century. 66% chance it's between 1799 and 1942. Okay, 25%, it's in the 1678 to 1741 range. So that makes the authorship unclear, but very clearly in the historic period. Hey, here's another one. Hey, this one is the one that I dated from Vermont, way up the Connecticut River in the town of Newbury that has a really rich Native American history. This is found at the turn of the last century, a really long, narrow canoe, and it came with a story because the town history of Newbury talks about a Native American, an Abenaki man, whose name was Joe Indian. And the history says, history written in 1902, which is a time you got to be careful because there's a lot of romantic, maybe apocryphal stories about Native Americans. But the town history talks about Joe Indian, who died February 19th, 1819, and how the remains of a log canoe were to be seen in Round Pond. Now, the radiocarbon dating might help. It's not going to prove who made the canoe, but it might rule that in or out. But this guy Joe is interesting because he crops up in another town in Stowe, Vermont, and this is from the undergraduate thesis by Jane Jordan. And here's the same guy. You can tell because his birthday is right there. And he made a canoe on this pond in Stowe and left it there. So he was pretty prolific in terms of depositing these canoes. What does the carbon date say? And here's Round Pond, and you know the drill by now. You can't get there from here. Landlocked pond. So this long canoe was made for use on this body of water. And there's our carbon date. This is very consistent with that story of Joe, the Abenaki man. Does not prove that he made it. Does not prove that he was there. But it is consistent with it. And you can see the different ranges down here. Clearly historic, but in northern New England, this is a time when the Abenaki and Europeans are very much both on the scene. Okay. Now, we drop back down to Londonderry, New Hampshire. This is sort of the remnant of a canoe found in a little pond, Scoby Pond. You can see really clearly the burning left over from its manufacture. Okay? And there it is, the little pond that you can't get to. Okay? So once again, we have a purpose-built boat and the radiocarbon date. Hey, now this one, we're getting older here. A conventional date, 1730 to 1790. And you can see the ranges down here. Also a possibility, 21%, could be 1648 to 1695. Now, still in this part of sort of southeastern New Hampshire, we know Europeans were here at this time. So the authorship is still a little bit unclear on this. Okay? Now, next, okay, over to, this is the fifth of seven here, over to the seacoast area of New Hampshire. Okay? But we're still in the Merrimack River drainage. And this is the only canoe I found that didn't come off the bottom of a lake or a pond. It came out of the muddy bank of a river, a little river that's a tributary of the Merrimack River called the Powwow River. And there again, comes up in the 1930s, and there's the obligatory picture of somebody sitting in the canoe. It's very nicely displayed here. And okay, this is one where you actually can get there from here. The Powwow River is navigable by canoe. So this one is exceptional in a couple of respects. And here's our carbon date. Okay, this is old, getting old. Okay, 250 plus or minus 30, so conventional date in that range. Now, in southeastern New Hampshire, there is European contact at this time and the beginnings of European settlement. But there is also, this is the time from King Philip's War leading up into the beginning of the French and Indian Wars. There is a substantial native presence here. The best bet would probably be a native canoe, particularly when you look at some of these ranges here. It's basically an 80% chance it's 1680 AD or earlier. And then, okay, the final of the six that I dated last year. This is up in sort of the western part of New Hampshire. There's a lake, Crescent Lake, that straddles the towns of Ackworth and Unity. And this really substantial canoe came off the bottom of the lake from the town of Unity. So somewhere up in here, found in 1983. This is a really large boat. And this is not a big body of water. Okay? And this is not some place that you can get to from anywhere else. So once again, a purpose-built boat for this body of water. There it is on a topographic map. And we got the date, and the date came back exactly the same as the one from the Powwow River, 250 plus or minus 30. And you can see here the various percentages. So once again, basically about a 75% chance it's 1680 or younger. Now, in this part of New Hampshire, unlike the eastern part, in this part of New Hampshire, that means this canoe is native. European presence here is minimal. There are a few traders, a few sort of explorers. Settlement hasn't really begun. And to build a substantial boat of this size on a little upland pond, I think this is almost certainly a Native American boat. Then I have those. Those are all my dates from 2025. And my last one, we're going to return to the boat that sort of started it all off. The one, two boats actually from Fitzwilliam. Uh, Now, these boats were found very close to each other. They're really just about identical in size, okay, in every respect. They each have tapered ends, tapered stern, tapered bow. So this is the form, the style that's supposed to look like, that's supposed to be pre-European contact. But these are the boats that were dismissed as being animal troughs or being used by Europeans to haul grain. Um, and a few years ago, with one of my anthropology students as part of her senior thesis, we got the money to get a radiocarbon date. We took a sample from one of the canoes. We assumed, since they were essentially identical and found next to each other, that they were contemporaneous. Okay? And there's Laurel Lake, and once again, you can't get there from here, body of water. So these boats are purpose built. And the radiocarbon date came in, and this is the oldest one of the seven that I've had in this project. So the standard date 1660 to 1720 AD. And if you look down here, basically a little better than 80% chance that it is earlier than 1674. Now, in the Monadnock region, that is well prior to the earliest European settlement. European settlement begins in this area really in the 1730s. So this is turns out to be our best, our strongest case for a pre-contact Native American canoe. So that was a really interesting result, and really sort of capped this off. Now, I want to head for the finish line here. Because one of the things, and I love doing studies like this because you so often wind up with conclusions that you weren't expecting to get, and they lead you off in a different direction. And one of the things that really just started jumping out at me was this whole business of, why is this supposedly extinct archaic tradition continuing all the way into the 20th century? How do we understand that? What is the evidence for that? And to answer that, I think you really have to get into the historical records, but those are a little tricky. But I started looking around. Now, there's another canoe that was found up on Squam Lake and wound up in a museum in Shelburne, Vermont, and then just a few years ago was radiocarbon dated. Came back with quite a broad range. But as part of the discussion about dugout canoes on Squam Lake, also came up with this newspaper article from 1939 talking about the dugout canoe on Squam Lake, and saying that there were memories with living people of this canoe being made by somebody who wanted to use it to get across the lake, thought they'd make a dugout canoe, made it. It's got a very unusual shape. Took it across the lake, and it tipped over, and his passenger drowned. Okay? And there's the story, and the canoe sunk. Okay? So it's interesting. This would be 19th century. You've got some presumably Euro-American people trying to make a dugout canoe. But this seems a little strange, a little exceptional. More informative was some information I got through my colleagues in Vermont. And it turns out that there's good evidence that in Vermont, all the way into the 20th century, in the rural areas, people are making and using dugout canoes. So we have this one account, okay, from this family. This is in living memory of using a dugout canoe to trap muskrats. And this is interesting. Why would you trap muskrats? Well, their pelts were useful. Okay. But in particular, their musk, the thing that gives them their name, was very valuable to the perfume industry. And so poor people in the upland rural areas of Vermont would trap muskrats as a way of making some cash income. And here we have an account of somebody doing this with a dugout canoe. Okay, that again is in living memory. And we've got two more accounts, very much the same thing. This is both from Jane Jordan's wonderful compilation of information from Vermont. So two more canoes, again, both within living memory, and both of them ascribed as being used for muskrat hunting. So we're starting, and this is something we need to learn more about. We're starting to understand why this technology persists, and maybe how its use has changed over time. So, to wrap it up, I've got 10 takeaways, okay, really quickly, and then a couple of things for future research. So what did I learn doing all of this? Number one, the dugout canoes are significant. They're out there. There are a lot more of them than we thought. And they are really part of the archaeological record of a lot of towns in New Hampshire and Vermont. The pattern of them being purpose built for these little ponds is one that I didn't really expect to see reinforced so much. But the problem with this is I actually think our sample is skewed, because if you're using a canoe on a little inland pond and you sink it to the bottom and don't come back, it's going to preserve. But canoes that are used on major rivers or on the ocean, I think, are much less likely to preserve. There are too many things that could lead to their destruction or loss. So I think we're not seeing a big part of the picture. We are seeing one part that tells us something we didn't really know before, but not the entire picture here. Number four, this pattern of these canoes being intentionally sunk and then brought up to be used the next year. So these things could have lasted for many, many, many years. And it also tells us that Native people are coming back to the same places at the same time of year over and over again. This is a pattern we see for a very long time in New England, for thousands of years. There's a lot of variation in terms of size. This goes back to Roger Williams' observation, but the ones we've been able to look at, anywhere from 12 to 21 feet, and there's no match with the size of the body of water they're on. We get some pretty substantial canoes made on some pretty small ponds, and vice versa. Okay. A lot of different woods. The most common seems to be pine, but there were a lot of other options there, and Native people took advantage of them. Number seven, you find one canoe, look for others, because that has been something we've seen in a number of cases. And that really suggests that there is a community of people, not just one individual, but a number of people working together who all use their canoes at the same time, sink them at the same time in the same place. We also, what Marianne Plain suggested, is really reinforced by this. There is a change in the form of these boats after European contact, particularly the sterns. The back of the boats tend to be squared off once you get into the 1700s. Just speculation, part of that may be because you can now take down a tree with a metal saw, as opposed to an axe, which is going to leave you with a sort of naturally tapered end. But that definitely does happen. The surprising thing for me, I did not appreciate this going into it, was that they really survive into the 20th century, particularly in the remote, poor areas of rural New England as part of a traditional technology. And it really kind of made me think about this whole line that we like to draw between the Indians and the Europeans. And really, what this technology says, you have native people who have made these boats for thousands of years. You have some Europeans who come over with their own tradition of making log boats. They're sharing the same space. In some cases in northern New England, they're intermarrying. And maybe what we see is a tradition by the time we get into the 1600s, 1700s, a tradition that is not Indian, that is not European, but is actually a New England tradition that incorporates influences from both of those places and kind of makes us appreciate that the history of this region really does involve both people, not only long ago, but all the way up to the present as well. And so for me, that was one of the biggest takeaways of all of this. Now, this is my second to last slide here, and future research. And this one actually has some action to it. So I'm gonna click this. This is another canoe, a dugout canoe, which is still underwater in central New Hampshire, brought to my attention just a few months ago. So here is some footage taken by the diver. Okay? And these days, the protocol, if you're an archaeologist, if you find one of these things, is to leave it on the bottom of the pond. It is safe there. It will stay preserved there. And once you bring it up, you have all kinds of preservation challenges. So there it is. And we're working on ways to get some data from it while it's still underwater. So, future research. Okay? Find and date more canoes. There are a lot more that are still out there. Okay? Work on this whole business of preservation and protection because while they do preserve better underwater, there's also the danger that once they're known, they'll get vandalized, okay, or hit by boats or any number of other things. We have to look more into the oral traditions and the local histories to find out about local people in rural areas who don't typically make it into the history books, who are the ones that are still using and preserving this technology. And another thing is when we find canoes, especially if they're Native American canoes, a couple of them in a little pond, isn't there likely to be a site nearby where people were living, or at least a hunting camp or something of this sort? So, can we find those sites, those terrestrial sites that go along with these canoes? And then finally, collaboration. And we have native people who are making these canoes today and bringing this technology back. And we have archaeologists who are finding these boats on the bottom of ponds. We have things to say to each other. I have learned a lot from what the modern native people have been doing with these canoes, and I'm sure that they in turn would be interested in the things that we're finding as well. So these are directions I'd like to take this project in. And then my final slide is just a big thank you. I had a lot of help on this project. And so I want to thank the organizations that hosted this tonight and all of my colleagues who helped enlighten me on this and provide me with data and provide me with access to the canoes. And so that is my story, and I'm sticking to it. And so I guess I'll go back to our hosts and see what we have for questions. And once again, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. So yeah, Brett, what do we have for
Yeah,
questions?
thank you so much, Bob. This was fascinating. There's a ton of questions, which is always I think, the mark of a really intriguing talk. We might not get to all of them, but um, I want to start with one. There was a lot of discussion in the chat about, you talked about purpose built for use on these small ponds, and there was, and then you talked about the muskrat hunting and trapping in a more modern times. But there was a lot of discussion about what was the purpose and people were saying fishing or maybe beaver hunting or deer. Or can you talk a little bit more about what what you think the purposes were?
Yeah, I think, and I really do not have much evidence for this. Okay. But I think, and again, sort of step back and what we know from the historic accounts and from the modern native people who are making those boats represent at least 2 weeks of serious, I would guess, fairly tedious labor. That's not an undertaking you do lightly. And so I think with a boat like that, you want to get the most bang for the buck. You'd probably use it for as many different things as possible. Certainly fishing, certainly trapping. Maybe a little bit of travel or transport. Maybe things we're not aware of at this point. Maybe even hunting. If you think about hunting some of the migratory birds that come to these bodies of water, a boat like that might have been useful. So my guess would be, well, they're purpose built for a particular body of water. The emphasis would be using them for as many things as possible. Good
Great, thank
question.
you. Um, Liz, I think, wanted to know what should you do if you find one? Who do you contact? Should they email you? Is there a state agency that they should reach out to?
Good question. A couple of things. They could certainly email me. Okay. And then sort of the question is not only how do you protect and preserve them, but there's also a question, this is always an issue in archaeology, is a question about ownership. Now, one of the things in New Hampshire, under statute that goes back a long time, the state of New Hampshire has the rights to anything on the bottom of lakes and ponds within their natural boundaries. Okay, so if a pond is dammed and expanded, that's beyond its natural boundaries. But within the natural boundaries, it belongs to the state of New Hampshire, and so would be protected under the historic preservation laws, and it would really be the Division of Historical Resources in Concord that would sort of take the lead on this. And both state archaeologists in New Hampshire and Vermont said to me the current protocol is, unless there's a good reason to, leave them where they are. Okay? We can study them underwater. Okay? It's a little more labor intensive, a little more costly, but can be done. Uh,
Fantastic. Constance, in the early part of the talk, asked if you have any sense for how heavy the dugout canoes were compared to birch bark. Like, was it possible to carry them out of the water at all, or would you only ever leave them in the water once they'd been built and put there?
I actually do have a firsthand insight into this. A few years back, the Monadnock Center for History and Culture in Peterborough was doing an exhibit on early local history and made a formal request to borrow the Franklin Pierce canoes for the exhibit. And so I helped move them with some professional movers. They're heavy. They're heavy. Unlike a birch bark canoe, I would not want to take a 20-foot dugout canoe and have to portage it any great length. Now, if you had a big group of people, you could do it. Okay, but it would be a task. They are certainly substantial, heavy boats.
Great. Okay, there's a couple questions about the carbon dating. They're kind of technical questions, but one was, is there any research on the accuracy of testing specimens that have been out of the water for many decades versus ones that were newly exposed to air? Does that make a difference?
To my knowledge, that makes no difference at all. Yep, none whatsoever. One of the one issue I ran into with some of these was not so much being out of the water, but once they come out of the water, they can be fairly fragile, and so it's not uncommon to find that people tried to preserve them by saturating them with some sort of preservative. And one of the canoes we had, the one from the Powwow River, in the 1930s, to try and stabilize it, they soaked it in linseed oil. And that is going to skew the radiocarbon dates, but the carbon dating labs have developed a pre-treatment technique to deal with that. And so we anteed up a little more money that pre-treatment was done. But no, as far as in the water, out of the water, I don't think that makes any difference.
Great. And another question about carbon dating. I guess Donna maybe is interested in having some things carbon dated. Is this a very expensive endeavor? Is it something that's people can
Yeah,
send off to labs on their own?
you certainly can. They'd be happy to take it and run a date for you. Um, and it sort of depends what form of carbon dating you're using. If you're using the traditional method, which requires a little more material, the last time I ran one of those dates, it was about $325. Might be a little bit more now. The AMS dates that I was running on this sample, those were each $700. Okay. Not cheap, but not out of the ballpark either. So,
Okay. I think I think we've got all the questions. I might have missed oh, one last one from Jane is, were any of these canoes resubmerged or they're just out of the water now? All the ones that you sampled are basically in museums, or has there been talk about resubmerging them for preservation's sake?
these are all out of the water and have all been out of the water for many decades. And so given that, there'd be no good reason to resubmerge them. My understanding of this is the real threat in terms of preservation is right at that initial moment when you take them from the water onto the shore. And I've read at least one account of a boat being taken out and then just sort of falling apart. But once it's out and it's dried, they seem to be fairly stable. Uh, so yeah, good question.
And there is, for folks who are able to stay just one more minute, there's a question about dendrochronology. So the process of aging trees by looking at their rings, is that of use here too?
That is has not really been developed here the way it is in the Southwest. That's where it works really well. And part of the reason it works well in the Southwest is because you have trees that live to be for a really long time. And it's also so arid that trees will preserve. You can excavate Pueblo sites and find the vigas or the beams in the Pueblo site. And by using tree ring dating, you can find out they were put in 1200 years ago, and they've been able to build that sequence because old wood is preserved so well. We don't have that preservation here. And another problem is that tree rings really are measuring differences in rainfall more than anything else. And in the Southwest, it's much more common to have very broad patterns of annual precipitation. So if it's a dry year, it's a dry year all over Arizona and New Mexico. Whereas in other parts of the North America, the rainfall can be much more locally variable. So it would throw that sort of thing off, even if we had the old wood to deal with, which we don't. So, but yeah, another good question.
All right, and I think there's one last one. We'll end with this one. You've talked about this a little bit, but Richard's asking, have you contacted local Abenaki or other Native people about these particular canoes? Have you talked with folks about the ones that you're studying now?
I have. I have. And in fact, I've been working with local Abenaki people for the better part of 30 years. And some of what I've learned about the canoes I talked about tonight, the first thing I heard about them was from some of my contacts in the Abenaki community. So yes, very much so. Yep.
Wonderful. Well, that seems like a good place for us to wrap up. And thank you so much, Bob, for another really incredible and fascinating glimpse um, at history and human life in our region. And thanks so much again to the Mount Kearsarge Indian Museum for partnering with us to bring this program to everyone. And thanks to all of you for joining us. It was a really great night, and we hope to see you again sometime soon.
Okay.
So
Thank you very much,
thank you,
folks.
Bob. Thanks,
Have a good
everyone.
evening. Okay. Bye-bye.